thank you to Boaz, who forced me to make the transition to what I'm not sure may or may not be Christian Kabbalah after hearing Yossi's lecture just now. I'm not so sure anymore. But in any case, it's Kabbalah written primarily in Latin and written about primarily in German. It was quite a fun few weeks. I was so worried about preparing out of my range that I asked Boaz to change the title from the Kabbalistic trees and the Kabbalah Denudata to Kabbalistic trees in the age of Kabbalah Denudata, because then I could talk about something else. It didn't work out. But in the end, I just bit the bullet, and today's presentation has once again gone without the age loophole, and you'll hear about the Kabbalah Denudata in particular. So, without further delay. Diagrams have figured in Kabbalistic literature from its medieval beginnings. Their early forms are simple and most closely resemble the arbor of porphyry or the concentric circles of contemporary astrological treatises. There is no anthropomorphism in these images, but merely a kind of sacred geometry, though the arbor diagram is easily mapped to the human form. Faces, essentially late medieval anticipations of our smiley emoticons, are a feature of Kabbalistic divinity maps only in the exegesis of the Zoharic Idrot, beginning with Rabbi David ben Yehuda Chassid, and subsequently with the development of the Lurianic school. These faces, or partsufim, representations of the post-Shvira personality configurations of the Sfirot, have obvious human characteristics from the emotional to the anatomical, together with the biological developmental orientation of Luria's thought that viewed cosmic history in terms of the divine autogenesis, from fetus to suckling to sentient being. It would be difficult indeed to avoid an anthropomorphic reading of this Kabbalah. As Gershom Scholem emphasized, these parts of the Lurianic Kabbalah undoubtedly represent the greatest victory which anthropomorphic thought has ever won in the history of Jewish mysticism. The conception of man as a microcosmos and the living God as a macro-anthropos has never been more clearly expressed and driven to its farthest consequences. It's certainly no coincidence that the Zoharic author has Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai open the Idra Rabbah with the warning to make no idol, meaning to take literally the teachings he's about to transmit. And Rabbi Chaim Vital would reiterate this point most emphatically in his introduction to his Etz Chaim. Whether or not we should take these warnings at face value from the standpoint of Christian Kabbalah, this new emphasis on the divine personalities and their human features or faces furnishes the second wave of this tradition with considerably more material, ostensibly ripe for Christological interpretation. I say ostensibly primarily because the task of reading Lurianic Kabbalah Christologically was not quite as easy as equating Smiley with the baby Jesus. The relatively simple theosophy of early Kabbalah, Vital in the same introduction opines that it could be treated easily in a few works that a student could master in days, gave Christian Kabbalists 10 sfirot from which individual attributes or triplet groupings could be isolated and identified with a father, a son, and of course a mother. If Luria is to Jikatila if Luria is to Jikatila as Einstein is to Newton, the quantum leap in complexity presented a new set of challenges to the Christological reader. The Lurianic system amplified the anthropomorphic elements that so lent themselves to identification with the Christian Godhead, but in a bewilderingly complex arcana. When not dismissive of the latter, Scholem was inclined to simply ignore it and paint the Lurianic system in broad mythic strokes. Relying on Scholem's authority, Alison Kudert maintained that Gilgul and Tikkun were the two most important aspects of Luria's thought. These grand concepts attracted the interest of figures from Rosenroth and Helmut to Leibniz, thanks to the impregnable theodicy they implied that reaffirmed God's goodness and justice. For Kudert, Luria was a figure who delighted in allegories, enigmas, and mysteries, which made his thought obscure and open to a wide variety of interpretations. In short, the theosophical thicket of Lurianic Kabbalah that fills nearly every page of its voluminous literature is easily overlooked in favor of a good story, a mythic narrative of undeniable pathos. But As Larry Gopnik explains to his failing student in the Coen Brothers' A Serious Man, you can't really understand the physics without understanding the math. The math tells how it really works. That's the real thing. The stories they give you in class are just illustrative. They're like fables, say, to give you a picture, an imperfect model. I mean, even I don't understand the dead cat. The math is how it really works. Tzimtzum, Shvira, Tikkun, these are the fables. The calculus of Lurianic theosophy are how it really works. Viewed in this light, Rosenroth's accomplishment in Kabbalah Denudata are all the more remarkable. His presentation of the Lurianic system is comprehensive, uncompromising, and unadulterated. He evinces thorough knowledge of the material available in mid-17th century Europe in manuscripts and early printed editions. Not content to present a translated anthology, Rosenroth crafted new, largely but not exclusively, synthetic works for his apparatus based on a range of sources. The Kabbalistic lexicon with which he opens the apparatus volume is the most voluminous example. No less impressive, however, is Rosenroth's collection of 16 trees or tables, the fourth and final section of the apparatus. If anything, Leibniz was too reticent in describing Rosenroth as perhaps the cleverest man in Europe concerning the knowledge of the most esoteric matters of the Jews. Kabbalah Denudata is an unusual work, exceptional in almost every respect. A massive multi-volume anthology published in Sulzbach in 1677 and then in Frankfurt in 1684 of an eclectic range of Kabbalistic texts, including the contributions of his contemporaries Ben Helmut and Henry Moore. Kabbalah Denudata represents the Summa of the 17th century second wave of Christian Kabbalah. Between the lines of its myriad pages, and occasionally in its texts and paratexts, is the conviction that in the Prisca Theologia of this lore, the true identity of Judaism and Christianity is to be found. Of course, according to this conviction, Jews would have to accept that the Partzufim were identical to the true mystical understanding of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. And Christians would have to stretch beyond their historical comfort zone and reconcile their Savior in theosophical terms far removed from any historical flesh and blood Jesus. This universal church ideology cannot be considered to have been a great success historically. Numerous enthusiasts were not to be found, and as a movement, the phenomenon was a flash in the pan. Jews and Christians alike were largely disinclined to accept the syncretistic mystical alternative to their great traditions. Even the initially enthusiastic Moore recoiled in disgust from the crude Lurianic anthropomorphisms he was unwilling to identify with the Christ. Andreas Kircher and Boaz Hus have suggested that the production of Kabbalah Denudata was part of a late 17th century Sabbatian-inspired circle of Jews and Christians working under the patronage of Prince Christian August of Sulzbach. Kabbalah Denudata would, however, outlast the modest and fleeting movement to which it owed its origins and influence the development of Western esotericism for centuries. Kabbalah Denudata's anthological character means that Rosenroth should not be considered its author in any simple sense. Indeed, Rosemarie Zeller has drawn attention to the fact that Rosenroth does not refer to himself in that capacity anywhere in the work. I would like to suggest the possibility of distinguishing between the overarching conversionist ambitions of Christian Kabbalah and even Kabbalah Denudata in general and the particular aspirations of Rosenroth himself. Kuder has argued that, like their Christian Kabbalist predecessors, Helmut and Rosenroth thought that they could use the Kabbalah to verify Christian doctrine and thereby hasten the conversion of pagans and Jews. My impression is that Rosenroth was far less interested in these goals than were his collaborators, Helmut and Moore. Helmut and Moore were content with getting the gist of Kabbalah and were thus far removed from the sensibility of Rosenroth, who obviously reveled in its particulars. If anything, Rosenroth hid his precise antiquarianism and enlightened scholarly ambitions behind the veil of traditional Christian Hebraicist conversionism. It seems that Rosenroth's contribution may not have been properly evaluated due to its engagement in the in-depth analysis and presentation of Lurianic texts, an engagement that was exceptional among Christian Hebraicist Kabbalists, but which is no less exceptional in modern scholarship. To a great extent, Zeller's remarks nearly 15 years ago that the Kabbalah Denudata was a work whose complexity is indeed emphasized repeatedly by the most recent research, but which has to date found no thorough scientific analysis, remain true today. Here I want to stress the importance of two 17th century Hebrew works of Rosenroth's project. First, Emek HaMelech, or Valley of the King by Naphtali Bacharach, published in 1648 in Amsterdam. In the second part of the apparatus, Rosenroth provides a summary of Emek HaMelech in the form of Kabbalistic theses. This section is followed by a response by Henry Moore, including a prefatory letter that Rosenroth published in its original English. Thanking Rosenroth for the Kabbalistical manuscripts you was pleased to send thither, Moore thanks Rosenroth. They, with your ingenious and learned answer to my objections and queries about some passages in Tractatus Primus Libri Drushim, have given me further insight into the Kabbalistical learning of the Jews. But that manuscript that is called Emek HaMelech is rife with so many abbreviatures and so small and imperfect a letter that much of it was unlegible to me. However, I have a general conception of the drift of the book and have taken notes of several particular passages thereof. I'm much encumbered with two great imperfections, the one that I cannot write a good hand, the other that I cannot easily read a bad one. It is, in fact, impossible to imagine the genesis of Kabbalah Denudata without Emek HaMelech. In the mid-17th century, very little Lurianic Kabbalah was available to scholars outside of the land of Israel. Israel Sarub, increasingly regarded as having been a student of Luria's before Chaim Vital's appearance, took his knowledge of this lore to Europe in the late 16th century. His writings, chiefly Limudei Atzilut, form the core of Emek HaMelech. Limudei Atzilut was not published itself until 1897. The publication of Emek HaMelech was thus widely viewed by rabbinic authorities as the lamentable, even tragic breach of secrecy of the most esoteric body of Jewish knowledge. That 1648 saw the Khmelnytsky massacres, as well as this scandalous publishing event, was not overlooked by contemporary critics. The printing of this lore meant that its dissemination was uncontrollable. If Emek HaMelech was hardly the popularization of Lurianic Kabbalah that Sholem suggested it did allow people access to hitherto unobtainable material. Rosenroth was one such person. Rosenroth had another printed work at his disposal that he used extensively, Sha'ar HaShamayim, The Gate of Heaven by Abraham Cohen de Herrera. It too was published in Amsterdam just 7 years after Emek HaMelech. The author was a student of Sarug's and a former converso who wrote the work originally in Spanish, ostensibly to rescue the truth and beauty of Kabbalah from the neglect of philosophers and the obscurantism of Kabbalists that kept it out of the reach of many interested readers. If Sarug's presentation of the Lurianic system has a distinctively philosophical tone, Herrera amplified this orientation and supplemented it with a generous syncretistic erudition akin to that displayed in the works of his friend Menashe ben Israel. My sense at this juncture is that Herrera's philosophical syncretism complemented the purist antiquarian tendencies of Rosenroth, and the Sha'ar HaShamayim was deployed by Rosenroth to sell the lore to his audience by enabling readers to view its arcana in terms they would find more familiar and congenial. In sum, Kabbalah Denudata constitutes what might best be viewed as a serious preparatory course for the learned Christian who would seek the keys to this ancient wisdom. Indeed, the etching on the frontispiece tellingly depicts keys dangling from the wrist of Lady Wisdom. Its presentation of Kabbalah is uncompromised and uncompromising, Kabbalistic material is presented throughout without interpolations. Jewish texts speak in their own language, metaphorically speaking, and even to some extent literally, as the core Zoharic material and technical terms throughout are presented in their original languages. Of particular interest are Rosenroth's original contributions to this course of study, the Kabbalistic literature he composed specifically for his reader, the lexicon, the theses, and the 16 trees, etchings executed by the same engraver responsible for the elaborate frontispiece, Johann Christoph Sartorius. It is to these trees that we now turn. Volume 1 of Kabbalah Denudata is then an apparatus on the book Zohar, aiming to provide the student with the ability to understand Zohar in Lurianic terms. The final section, consisting of over 40 pages and fold-out diagrams, contains the explanation of trees or tables of the 5 Kabbalistic universals, with a brief and comprehensive and summary representation of all the Kabbalistic chapters according to diverse hypotheses. What do the texts key to the figures in Kabbalah Denudata say? What is their provenance? How do they engage the diagrams? Well, first of all, we find translations of embedded texts. In the first collection of figures, these translations are numbered but not key to the figures, leaving the reader with an arduous task of correlation. We'll see that in a moment. There are also translations of textual materials found in various Ilanot or Kabbalistic tree manuscript families. And we find in these adaptations of other Kabbalistic material, chiefly derived from Emek HaMelech, as well as original material, including sections from the apparatus, other sections in the apparatus, the lexicon, and the theses. Not only had no Christian Kabbalist ever presented diagrams approaching these 16 figures, but no Jewish Kabbalistic work would appear in print with comparable material until nearly 200 years later. Indeed, the Jewish work, printed first in Warsaw in 1859, based on a manuscript of the Ilan prepared by Meir Poppers for his students in Krakow around the time of the publication of Kabbalah Denudata, shares considerable material with Rosenroth's figures. Of the 16 figures in Kabbalah Denudata, only 2 or 3 cannot be matched up with frames appearing in the Poppers' Ilan. Just a word about Meir Poppers, whose Ilan was the significant source for the diagrams in Kabbalah Denudata. He is the man who was responsible for a redaction of Lurianic material known as Etz Chaim, based on Vital's original writings. The Poppers redaction became essentially the canonical version of Lurianic Kabbalah for Jews beginning in the 17th century and later. Poppers himself was part of a lineage going back to Chaim Vital through Yaakov Tzemach, who has interesting converso background, and Chaim Vital's son Samuel. And tellingly, I think significantly, Poppers, in addition to being responsible for this canonical recension of Lurianic text, is also responsible for the most popular of the Kabbalistic diagrams, or Ilanot, that was published, as I said, for the first time in Warsaw in 1859, but which exists in many manuscripts. And now I'm just showing you, as if we have it before us, a manuscript scroll of the Poppers' Ilan. The Poppers, like many of these Jewish Ilanot, was produced on a parchment scroll that would be read by rolling. And what we find in the Kabbalah Denudata is that essentially he's taken frames from the scroll and put them onto fold-out pages that are inserted into the last part of the apparatus alongside these keyed guides to the material or the meaning of these diagrams. So, how closely do the figures of Kabbalah Denudata follow the Poppers' Ilan and the texts? What's the relation between the texts in the Poppers' Ilan and the texts that we find in the Ilanot, in the diagrams of Kabbalah Denudata on the one hand, but also in the key that he provides to each of those 16 diagrams? Because Kabbalah Denudata does something that we don't find in the Poppers, that is, he supplements the diagrams, which in the original, and at least in some of the diagrams, are full of embedded microtexts with this explanatory commentary that comes between each of the etchings. What do the texts say? Who wrote them? And what about the provenance of the diagrams in Kabbalah Denudata that are not in the Poppers model? And what do the answers to these questions tell us about Rosenroth as a Kabbalist? So, how do the diagrams match up? Poppers presents one extended diagram that begins quite literally before the beginning and scrolls continuously for nearly 5 meters through the stages of creation and emanation until reaching the celestial spheres and our lowly earth. The multiple frames of the Poppers scroll present an integral diachronic synoptic cosmological map. The Poppers scroll is one Ilan. You've just seen it. Roughly 90% of the graphic and microtextual material in the 16 figures of Kabbalah Denudata can be matched to frames from Poppers. That said, Rosenroth has not simply slavishly copied from his source. The scroll has been broken into figures, and the figures are not meant to be read as one continuous sequence, but as 3 distinct trees. Moreover, the Poppers material has been rearranged to suit his novel presentation. In this Christian Kabbalist's Roshamon, the three trees present different perspectives from which the Lurianic cosmology might be viewed. Okay. Okay. Now it gets a bit confusing. Here's just a quick example of a piece of the scroll of a classic Popper's manuscript, and you're seeing the Kabbalah Denudata on the other side. Okay, all right. Right, okay, it's running away on its own. I wasn't even paying attention. What I tried to do, I was about to set it up, but it has a mind of its own, apparently. What you have in this first diagram, or arbor of Rosenroth, in Rosenroth, is a very faithful copy of the comparable frame in the Popper's Ilan, and his key in Latin, which you see a fragment of on the right. One interesting thing I discovered was that there's no particularly obvious way to read the diagram, certainly not for one who doesn't have a fairly good background in Lurianic Kabbalah. What do you read it from? It's obviously something like top to bottom, but it's not completely top to bottom. As you saw, there are places where it goes from a lower part in the figure to a higher part in the figure, from the mouth to the forehead, for example. You see going from 14 to 15 before going down again. A person just dealing with Poppers or relying on its equivalent here in Rosenroth would not know necessarily how to approach it. But Rosenroth's key, in fact, which itself isn't the most user-friendly key you could imagine, because there aren't any Roman numerals on the Hebrew diagram he provides, right? But if you can somehow manage to figure out that where the Hebrew microtext in the diagram match up with his Latin translations, you can find your way to go through the officially correct emanatory flow of this map. Even though it's not necessarily intuitive, it is actually correct from a Lurianic theosophical point of view. So this is, again, just an example of how to read. This is characteristic of the first trees. With figure 8, we get to Rosenroth's second Ilan, second tree, and he explains in his key, in the introduction to that second tree, that he has based his key to the diagrams on the final chapter of Emek HaMelech, Valley of the King. That chapter basically presents a very brief summary of the entire Lurianic theory of emanation, and once again we don't have proper links to the figures, but he does provide in his commentary very close paraphrases of material that's in the final chapter of Emek HaMelech. And ultimately, some years later, when he published the second volume of Emek HaMelech, that material was then translated in full. But here you have fragments from that not yet published second volume, and he's basically made a précis of the précis of Emek HaMelech and linked it to these diagrams. Okay. I think I'm here. Wow, this is so complicated. Wow. problem is. You know what? 1 second. Yeah. You know what? The truth is, it's not the problem. The problem is that I can't see in the presenter mode what number slide I'm on, and that's really messing me up. I'm sorry to be so, sort of forthright about it, but it's just the way it's going right now. Hold on, give me a half a second for technical support. Displays. I need to stop the mirroring of the displays. And now, magically, I can figure out what slide I'm on. Yes. Okay. Thank God the tech nerd is here. He's me. So this is, okay, this is supposed to be...
Different things on the screen.
Okay. Anyway, that's like it's one off. Is this doing the whole thing again?
We'll get back down to the
Let me rush through it, is it? Well, anyway, so it's kind of interesting, okay, right? You have speaking of anthropomorphisms, we could talk a lot about it, but you have the upper head here. This is obviously a smiley. You have the ears, you have the mouth here, and the nose is here, and the beard is here, and the chest. Okay, so now we get to, how much time do I have? That's time without questions. Okay, so, all right. There's knowledge theosophy. Okay. Okay, so occasionally you find things amplified in Kabbalah, in his remarks, things that are only suggested in the diagrams. He's taking material that's presented only minimally and suggestively in the diagrams and embellished and expanded them using primarily material from the Emek HaMelech in his key. So, for example, here we see an example. We see his having taken a shorthand in the embedded texts. In the embedded text simply refers to the 231 gates, and he's supplying the reader, you can see here, with a sample of those 231 gates that are formed by combining the Hebrew letters in all their various combinations. Ultimately, in volume 2, we give all the tables. And here we have also an example of a diagram that's in Poppers that's hardly, really has no explanation in Poppers, but that Rosenroth has given a tremendous elaboration to on the basis of material that he's taken from Emek HaMelech. What you're seeing in the slide is his source in Emek HaMelech and his Latin translation of the material in Emek HaMelech to explain the fairly laconic diagram that he's taken from Poppers. Here he's been a bit more creative still. He's taken an image that you can see. This is a Poppers Ilan image, and this is an image that appears in Emek HaMelech, and he's combined the two and made basically one diagram that's integrating the material from both of those, which is impressive. And here you see, if anything, a kind of simplification where there's in this case somewhat more material in the parallel in Poppers than what we find in the version provided by Rosenroth, that is, of course, compensated for in the key. But, of course, we can't end this presentation without the famous picture, right? What's going on here? This one is hard to find in Poppers. Indeed, we don't see anything like that. Poppers didn't have probably such a good etching engraver at his disposal. But, in fact, although it's sort of striking, both in the the beauty of execution and the audacity of its anthropomorphism, the material basically can be correlated to material in Jewish Ilanot manuscripts. You see that on that same page, he's got some keyed figures of the spherotic trees. They are keyed with letters, and these letters are in fact based on a section in Emek HaMelech. And he has taken these significant letter abbreviations of theosophical terms from Emek HaMelech and keyed them to this famous head, so that if you're good at it, you can actually see exactly how things match up from the head to the little diagram he provides. And this is the key, which is actually now, since he's moved away from the Popper's material, he's getting better about providing alphanumeric keys in the diagrams that are more original. And you can literally go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and see exactly what each piece of theosophical wisdom from the Emek HaMelech that's been translated into Latin is how it finds itself onto this head of Arich Anpin. A Jewish version is slightly less impressive aesthetically, although this is a manuscript that provides quite a bit of the same information. If the face isn't exactly a striking success, how do you like this one? The same guy did this a few years later. I'm not sure if he's getting better or not. Your Postel got better, but I don't know about this guy. Mordechai Sassoon. But he did a nice job on the 13 attributes of the beard, and you'll see here, I think that's pretty nice. And if you compare it to the 13 attributes that appear in von Rosenroth's diagram, I think the Jewish guy did a much better job. So basically it's the same information. It's a richer presentation on the right. And here I'm just unrolling the scroll for you, which basically contains quite a bit of the same information. Here again, another fragment from the diagram in Rosenroth, and you see how the material is very similarly elaborated graphically in this Ilan manuscript. Final thoughts have to do with figure 16, the last in the series. This one is the let's see. Okay. Okay, here we go. The last diagram, figure 16, would appear to be the only fully original graphic in the collection, although, as we've seen, figure 12 was largely freshly visualized by Rosenroth on the basis of Emek HaMelech. There's also a diagram of the soul that's quite unusual. In this last diagram, Rosenroth seems to be saying, in effect, I've adapted, parsed, and keyed a wide variety of existing Ilanot. I've also fashioned innovative visual representations of key texts. Here, however, I attempt to provide a single synoptic summary of the Kabbalistic worldview. I distinguish between such cosmographical detail images and what we might call synoptic images. The latter provide a comprehensive picture of the whole system, albeit in varying degrees of complexity. So figures 13 to 16 are distinctive in their lack of embedded text. All text has been displaced from the diagrams and keyed alphanumerically to their accompanying chapters. The text in 13 to 15 consists of Rosenroth's Latin adaptations of textual elements found in the Jewish Ilanot upon which they were based. Figure 16, being an entirely new synoptic diagram, has the clarity and integration with its textual counterpart that we would expect, given the circumstances of its production. If Rosenroth opened this apparatus by referring to it as an explication of trees and tables, arburum sue tabula, in figure 16 we have a very clear tree to which a variety of tables have been linked sub litera. The tree of figure 16 is a composite of elements, some familiar and some novel. We take particular note of the 12 circular subdiagrams that occupy the bottom half of the frame. Alongside familiar iconic representations of the Sfirot, particularly objects M, O, and Q, there are objects the likes of which I've not encountered in other Kabbalistic divinity maps. Objects S, T, U, X, and Y stand out among them. Given the elemental, iconic, albeit unfamiliar simplicity of these sub-figures and their linkage to tables of various lists of divine names, angels, divine, earthly, and even demonic realms, their potential mnemonic application seems obvious. As a fan of Francis Yates and the more recent works of scholars of memory arts, including Mary Crothers and Lina Bolzoni, I've been asking myself since beginning my research on Jewish Ilanot whether these diagrams could have had a mnemonic function for their users. That I find no overt reference in the Ilanot themselves to such a function is telling but inconclusive. More curious is whether diagrams embedded with massive amounts of text, even if such a text was a précis of an entire eclectic corpus, could be deployed mnemonically. The typical Jewish Ilan looked very different indeed from the typical medieval and early modern arboreal memory image, with the stylized leaves featuring single keywords. Of course, Ilanot, like other visual schemas, could and did perform multiple functions, used for memory, invention, teaching, and meditation. In short, I remain unconvinced that mnemonics play any significant role in the Jewish Ilanot tradition, though I continue to consider the possibilities. Rosenroth's figure 16, however, strikes me as likely having been designed with this function in mind. If it is not strictly an arboreal memory palace, figure 16 is the concluding synthetic, synoptic image text and a series of image texts based on earlier synthetic materials, from the Popper's diagrams to the brief summary that brings Bachrach's Emek HaMelech to a close. The drive to distill the endlessly fractal complexity of Lurianism into brief textual expositions and manageable diagrams that begins with Vital and attains a level of sophistication and development in Rosenroth with few Jewish equals. Moreover, Rosenroth's original contributions to this genre make no attempt to integrate or interpolate Christological material or interpretations, making the Arbores of Kabbalah Denudata Jewish Ilanot in every respect. There is the small matter of the final lines of the text to figure 16. We read, Sed nomen nachash serpens undem habet numerem cum Mashiach, cui cortices eradicabit emundo, Isaiah 25:8. Having told us about the 7 palaces of the anti-sphirot, or klipot, Rosenroth concludes with their antidote. The klipot, the demonic realms, will be ultimately eradicated by the name of the serpent, Nachash, the numerical value of which is that of the Hebrew term for the Messiah, or Mashiach, fulfilling the promise of Isaiah 25:8. Christian readers will have been relieved that at the end of this long and arduous journey, or upon skipping to the last page of the book, they find the triumph of the Messiah, the reference to Isaiah's prophecy that he will swallow up death forever, and the refrain, Fini soli Deo gloria per Christum, to the glory of God through Christ. I suspect Rosenroth wanted to give precisely this experience to his pious and perhaps even hostile Christian reader. This encomium to Christ is so little and so late that it seems likely to have been tacked on for political reasons. Rosenroth would have understood the relationship between persecution and the art of writing very well. And if one aspect of this art is clever concealment, we might learn something from the verse in Isaiah cited here, but only provided in a partial Kabbalistic paraphrase. He will swallow up death forever, the verse begins, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people will he take away from all the earth, for the Lord hath spoken it. Has Rosenroth hidden here a powerful subtext of his entire project, the end of the reproach of the Jews? The choice of a verse that highlights the end of this universal reproach as constitutive of the Messianic era could not have been but the thoughtful statement, albeit slightly veiled, of a scholar at once occult and antiquarian, enlightened and messianic. Thank you.